Welcome back for part 2, which is the beginning of the coloring process. This is split into 2 different parts. So we'll begin with the first 4 images that I'm stamping, which include the White Rabbit, the Cheshire Cat, Alice, and the Queen of Hearts. And I'm stamping these using my Misty stamping tool. I'm using Memento Black Tuxedo ink. And I will be stamping 2 or 3 times in order to make sure that there is a crisp result. The reason I'm using this ink is because it is safe for Copic markers. I am stamping this onto the Copic Express It blending card, which is one of the supplies that I listed for this project. The reason I chose this paper is because it has the maximum blendability for Copics, and it's super bright white. So the colors that are put on there will look their best on the purest white background. So I have all the Copic markers pulled out. You can refer to your student guide for all the colors that you will need to color each of the images. So I'm going to be starting with Alice. And I have the finished card prototype to my left side so that I can refer to it as far as recoloring it. Now, what I will be doing is starting with the lightest color, which is Y11, and I'm highlighting the areas on the character's hair that will be left lighter in comparison to the rest of the hair. So I'm just kind of identifying where those areas are, thinking about if the light source is coming basically from the front, where the hair might look the lightest versus the darkest. And now I'm switching to my second darkest color, which is Y21. And I'm starting to fill in some of the areas, kind of going roughly with the lines that are already drawn into the character's hair to start adding some darker color. And I'm using a flicking motion. When I'm working my way down, I flick downwards and then I do the opposite coming back up, because this helps me avoid getting color where I don't intend for it to go. So it helps me stay within lines. And I'll just continue this process until I've added some of this first layer of color on top of the lighter color. And after I finish with this, I will go to my darkest color and start adding areas of darker color on top of this. So for the darkest color, I'm using E44. And then I'll start in the areas where the deepest shadows would be. So I'm also going to be using the lines that exist in the drawing. Plus under the bow, which I know you can't see very well because my hand is in the way, but there's not really a way for it to not be in the way. I start drawing downward and flicking with the marker. And then once I add some of these darker areas, I will pick up the other, or the next lightest color, which it would be the Y21, and I will blend that in over top of the E44 marker. And basically, I will continue this process to try to blend and even out the colors so there are no harsh streaks in between from one color to the next, and get a nice looking blend. So if you have used Nina Silver White in the past for coloring with Copics, it is still a really good paper to do that with. So I don't want to say that it is not, because I am not an expert in Copic or certified in it. However, I did find personally that using this particular paper did help quite a bit with blending. Sometimes that can be the hardest thing to learn if you're new or just getting more experience with Copic markers. I've been working with Copic markers for a couple of years now, and one of the hardest things for me to get any comfort level with at all has been with hair. So this is one of those areas where I can tell after a couple of years of practicing that it has made a difference. So I encourage you, if you're just getting started on using these markers and you feel like you're struggling with this area, I promise you the more that you practice this skill, the better that you get. And pretty much any artist that works with these markers is going to tell you the same thing. And I'll be finishing up by adding the areas of the darkest color, which are right underneath her face. I'm using Y21 to start with, and then I'm adding a good amount of the E44 on top of that, and then I will blend it out with the Y21. So it will be quite dark underneath the chin, both to the right side as well as the left. And now I'm going to start on coloring the face. I decided to keep the coloring fairly simple as far as the skin is concerned. I'm going to zoom in so that you can see a little bit better going forward as far as the coloring process. So starting with E00, I'm just simply coloring all over her face, neck, and then of course the arms. Since she's wearing stockings, there's no need to do the legs, so that makes it a little bit faster as far as having to color skin. And my next deepest color is E11, and I'm going to do just some very simple shading. I'm going to add shadows underneath the neck. I'm adding some shadows above the eyes just to make the eyes pop out a little bit more. I will also be adding a little bit of shading to all around the edge of her face, underneath the hairline. And after doing all of this, I will also blend that back out with the E00 marker. So I'm just keeping this part fairly simple. And I've seen a lot of artists that can use, multiple colors to color skin. So if that's your kind of thing, you can certainly get into adding far more colors and adding a lot of more depth and dimension. And I'm adding a little cheek color with this R20. And also just above to give the suggestion of lips. And blending that out with the E00 marker on each side. And now I'm going back to the arms, and I'm adding E11 at the very, very edge of each side of her arm, just so that it doesn't look so flat. It's kind of hard to see that because I'm holding the marker straight up and down, and when I'm trying to color a small area, it's much easier to hold the marker straight up and down and have your finger and thumb as close to the marker tip as possible. So now I'm using B00 and B000 for her eyes. And I'm using a white gel pen just to add a little white dot right above the pupil, because this makes the eyes look a lot more lifelike, because it looks like there's a catch light in the eye. So that's the reason that I do that, to make them look a little more realistic. And now I'll start coloring the dress with 3 different blue markers, and then the shadows on the white pinafore or apron will be in the cool gray. So start by just adding the lightest color of the blues, B12, on the bow, the collar, sleeves, and the parts of the dress that are visible underneath the white pinafore. And I will not be coloring the bottom layer that you see sticking out. Just going to be leaving that white. Once I have colored the entire dress in B12, I'll be adding a little more dimension. So we're just adding this dimension just a step at a time. And so I begin adding a little more depth by using the B14 marker, and I start adding some color to the bow at the back of the dress And then I start working my way around the skirt by adding some darker color at the edges of the skirt, and also close to where the hand is right in front of the skirt to add the shadow from her arm. So I'm going to do the same thing around the bottom edge of the skirt and the side, as well as on the bow, the collar, and the sleeves. Actually, I'm not coloring the collar blue. I'm leaving it white, so I just wanted to correct that as I move along on the coloring. So now that I've added the darker color, I'm using the B12 and going back over where I added the B14 and blending that inward, downward, or upwards depending on the direction where I applied it at first. And B16 is the darkest color, which I'm reserving for the very darkest areas of shadow in the dress. And this also helps to add more dimension overall to the project. So I concentrated on areas like where the folds of the dress are, mostly where they're drawn in. And I add a few more little lines in different areas just to continue to add the effect that there's more movement in that skirt. And finally, I'm adding it around the base of the sleeves and underneath the bow tie where the darkest areas would be. And C3 is a color that I'm going to be using to add some color to the lines that are on the white pinafore, so it doesn't look as flat either. So as you can see, I'm just going around the edge and adding a little bit of color everywhere there is a little ruffle or a little line indicating there is a fold in the dress. And there's not a lot of this to do, but just enough so that it adds some interest. And doing the same thing around the base of the dress in between where the blue and the white sections are. And finally, I'm adding some gray stripes to her stockings. And I'll color in her shoes as well after I do the bows, which I'm doing in B14, which is the middle blue color. And now I'll go back up to the bow and I'm adding the B12 color like I did on the dress at first, and then I'll go back just like I did over the dress with B14 to add even more dimension, and then on top of that I'll add B16 and I'll blend all these together. As you can see with the B14, I'm concentrating on the outer edges and also towards the inside where the fold of the bow is. And although my thumb's kind of hiding it, I'm just flicking outwards from where that little skull image is in the center. And then adding just a teeny tiny bit of B16 to make it go deeper. Flicking outwards, and then blending back over all of it while it's still wet with B12. So now I have a nice smooth blend from all three of the colors. So the last thing to do is finish her shoes, and I'm leaving just a slight circle there on the end just to indicate that's a spot where light is hitting, and add a little more dimension. So with the B000 marker, I'm adding some color to the little potion bottle that she is holding, E44 on the cork, and then finally this I think it's VO4 marker for the tag. If I got that wrong, it is in the guide. And one final step is I found a piece of her elbow that I had not colored, so I filled that in. And now I'll be moving on to the Queen of Hearts image. And I'm using some copy paper to mask off the other images that I have or have not colored yet. plus some Post-it removable tape just to hold that in place temporarily. And there's nothing worse than when you're working on a project like this and you're coloring multiple images and you do something like accidentally drop a marker onto your coloring, and it just can really ruin your day. So this is one of the things I did to minimize the risk of ruining another stamped image. Although if something happens, I definitely do my best to try to fix it if I possibly can. So I'll be using some similar markers on her hair, but not exactly the same. So I started with Y11 for the lightest part of the hair. And again, I'm just flicking downward from the top section, working a section at a time, and then go back over just basically the lower quarter on the bottom and the top of those two smaller sections of hair. So as you notice, I've left a little bit of white showing through, so that is going to function as the highlight. And I'm doing the same thing for each section of hair, just going at them one bit at a time. So first with Y11, then going over, say, the top quarter and bottom quarter with the Y15, and leaving a little bit of white highlighting in the center section. And using this E marker to add a little bit of extra dimension, a little more shadow. And again, E31. There's the marker. Should have put the pen cap down sooner so we could easily see what I was working with. And I'm back to Y11 again, working on that outside section of hair, using the Y15 marker to repeat the same process. And finally, E31 to darken it up at the very, very top and bottom edges. And I know this gets a little bit repetitive to watch, and sometimes it's hard to find a lot to talk about. At this point, what you're seeing is just a repeat of what I did on all the other sections of hair. And very soon, I'm going to be moving on to the red markers that will make up the other part of this image. So we're about ready to move on to that very shortly. So I hope you're enjoying what you're seeing so far, and that maybe you've picked up possibly a tip or two. If you're an advanced person, maybe not necessarily, but if you're still learning some stuff, I'm hoping that some of these tips will help you. So starting with the red section of hair, I'm mainly using this R14 and R24, and I'm handling this pretty much the same way I did with the yellow markers, using the lightest one to flick down from the top section of hair, flick up from the bottom part, and leaving a little bit of white highlighting there on the hair. And then doing the same on another section that has a longer but thinner strand of hair. Now switching to R24 and drawing over the end where I've already colored, so while it's still wet, it's a lot easier to blend it in at that stage. So it's best to just work small sections at a time instead of coloring everything all in the lighter color and then trying to come back and color it over with another darker color. So I've just found it's better when you're trying to blend the colors to just work in small sections at a time. So again, just using the same flick strokes up from the bottom of the hair shaft or down from the root area, and gradually meeting in the middle. And if you find it difficult to get into these small areas, like I'd said before, the easiest way to handle that type of coloring when you're in a very, very tight spot is to make sure that you're holding your marker straight up and down and holding your fingers right down as close to you can get to the marker, the brush, the nib of the marker, without actually touching it. So if you're doing that kind of thing, the detail color, it's best to keep your Copic markers as clean as possible, or else you're going to end up with pretty inky fingers if you don't do that. And I find that just some basic 91% alcohol is very inexpensive to get and use to clean the barrels of your markers. And you can use a Q-tip to reach inside the side of the cap or inside of the cap to clean your markers out. And as you can see, I've already started working on the skin, and for every character I'm using the exact same 2 colors. One is for the base color and the other for the contrast. At least for all the characters that have skin, because not all of them do. So now I'm coloring her eyes using BG11, and just to make them a little more dimensional, I will come back and add BG15 to make them a little bit darker. And as you can see, I've already added the white gel pen. And using that tip I just shared, I colored her lips with the R24 marker by holding it straight up and down and holding my fingers very close to the end of the barrel. And now I'm adding some more shadows with the 44. Going back and blending over with the Y15 marker. And so you can see right underneath her arm. That's where it would be darker because her arm is in front of her hair. So I'm just working on making that look a little more realistic. And now I'm getting close to working on the dress. I picked up a Copic multi-liner because I noticed a little white dot on one of the stamped image lines on her hair, so I just filled that in so that it was solid black again. So those Copic multi-liners are incredibly helpful for, say, a very small area where maybe the stamping wasn't perfect. And on the yellow parts of the dress, I will be using Y15. So I'm starting in the center where that kind of the heart shape is there right in the middle of the bodice of the dress. And since I have the marker in my hands, I'm going ahead and adding that to the crown. And using the R24 marker to just barely touch each area where there's a little jewel in her crown. So just barely touching it will get just enough color in that area. And then I start working on the red sections in the dress, starting with the little tiny hearts. And as you can see, I'm holding the marker vertically, and I have my fingers really close to the end of the barrel as I'm working on that. And just around the very edges of the crown where I've already colored yellow, I'm adding just a teeny tiny bit of R24 on the sides. And now I'm going down to the base of the dress where it has that ruffle and adding some R24 to that part of it. So with this dress, it's just a lot easier to kind of work one little section at a time with one color at a time. So I'm concentrating first on all the areas now that are red. And the majority of the color that will be left to do is black. However, when I do get to the black, as you'll notice, I will not be using, for the most part, a pure black marker. I'm using a few different shades of gray, including C9, which is about the darkest gray, cool gray marker that there is. I'm just going around and adding the color around the bottom of the bodice area, as well as the bottom part of what I'm calling kind of the heart there in the center, or the swirls that come around from the bottom side of it. and about to finish up with that section. And then I move back up to the top because there is a little bitty heart on the neck, kind of the neckline area. And now I'm finished with my red part of the dress. And now I'm moving on to working on the skirt. Starting with N5, which already, as you can see, looks really dark already. So using black on an object can be really difficult if you start right with 100. And I will use a little bit of 100, but actually very sparingly. So you start with a lighter gray marker, kind of in that mid-tone range, so that you can have some highlights on the black skirt. And you'll see that more when I get to the center section of the skirt. On the outside edges, I'm leaving the overall color darker than I do in the very, very center of the skirt. And when I get to that, I will be leaving quite a few areas that are almost white in the very, very center to add more movement and dimension to the skirt. So I blend back over where I colored with C9 with my N5 marker. And the only reason I'm not using a C5 marker here is because I don't have one. And unless you're extremely picky about mixing up your cools and neutrals, I don't really have a problem with mixing neutral and cool. Warm grays, however, are quite different, so I don't think that would work very well. But at least with neutral and cool, it seems to work okay. And I will be speeding through this section because there's not really anything new that I'm going to be showing you as far as changing colors, because I'm doing the same process that I followed on the outside edge of the dress. Now you will notice that I'm about to make a big mistake on the dress, and I'm going to color the wrong section there on the right hand side. This is my first video where I just got all the way through it, didn't even notice that I had colored the wrong section of the dress. But yeah, it's already done, and I'm not going to be doing it again. So anyway, moving on to the center of the dress. So kind of back down to just, speeding it up 2 times the actual speed that I colored. I start by outlining all around the center section with the N5 marker. Then I start adding flicks from the top where I have built in that line, and then repeating the process on the bottom. And I am purposely leaving that center section light and not coloring it in completely solid. So now I'm changing to the C9 marker, and I'm going to gradually start getting a little bit darker. I start up in the center with that V, and I almost always draw a line around the edge, the border of where I'm coloring, so that it makes it much less likely that I'm going to make a mistake in color in a section that I'm not intending to, except for apparently what I did up above on the bodice of the dress. But anyway, I digress. I'm doing the same process here by just drawing a little bit of a lead line across the bottom of the skirt, and then I start using that line to start flicking up towards the center of the dress. And as I get around to the outside edges, I angle it in a bit towards the center, so it's not exactly completely vertical as I'm moving along, because the dress skirt is not exactly vertical and it's going to have some movement. So finally, I'm adding just a teeny tiny bit of the 100 marker, which is the pure black color. I'm not going to be adding much of it at all, but just putting it in some places just to add even more depth onto the skirt and give it more of the look of having lots of folds, although that isn't necessarily drawn in on the image. By using markers, you can build in that effect yourself. And I blend over those with the C9 and N5 just to make sure it's blended well. And I've picked up the R24 marker again, and I'm going back over that hemline and deepening the color by coloring over each of those little pleats at the bottom. And then I'm using an N5 marker on those pleats on the sleeves. Then going back with the N5 and blending that out. And adding a little bit of N5 on the seam of the sleeve and as well as around the collar. So the finishing part to this whole image is just filling in that white space on the crown. I start with N5, then switch to C9 like I've done on every other section as far as the black is concerned, and just blend those two in together. And then finally, I'm coming back and adding that BG15 to the eyes, like I said I was going to do a lot earlier in the process. And now, moving on to the White Rabbit. I think this is one of the most fun characters out of all of them. And just to share a little bit of something fun, when I was in high school, I was actually Alice. I played the role of Alice in Alice in Wonderland when I was a senior in high school. And it just so happens that my brother played the part of the White Rabbit, who is a couple of years my junior. So just kind of a fun thing as to why this particular set really appealed to me is because of that, because of my fond memories of the play, and also because I know this is one of those classic tales that a lot of us have fun and nostalgic feelings for. Maybe me more in particular because of the fact that I participated in this play. So I'm starting the coloring process on the coat, starting with R24, and then I will be adding more depth and shadows to the coat by using R29 and R89. So after I finish doing the base color of the coat with R24, I switch to R29 and start darkening up the edges of the coat. And right now, as I'm working on the base color of R24, I'm just working carefully around where the chain goes across the coat and also near where the gloved, or I don't know, maybe it's a gloved hand, maybe it's just a white furry paw, whatever it is. In any case, now I'm coloring the coat sleeve up by the hand, up at the top. Since it's so close to the clock, you have to really pay attention to what you're coloring, or else you might accidentally color the part of the clock that's in the hand up there on the, basically on the side up there. And there's also a button on that cuff that's up here, up there in the corner by the clock, so you have to be careful not to accidentally color over that, because you want to make sure that it's yellow instead of red. So now I'm adding the R89 and really adding some distinction between the colors on the coat. So this is not something I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to blend together with the other red colors, because I want it to stand out at the bottom as though we're bias binding, something to that effect. And now I'm switching to the yellows that I'm using for the vest, and because it's such a small area, there really isn't a lot of shading can really be done, but I do a little bit with Y35 on top of the Y15. And next, doing the buttons, and again, they're pretty small, so I'm adding the Y15 as a base layer, and then adding a little bit of contrast with Y35. The next stage in the process is coloring the blue bow, and I'm using B12 as the base color, like I did on the dress on Alice earlier. And then I'm using B14 to add a little shadow there towards the center of the bow, and then blend it out with the B12. You can't really get a third color in there, so I just left it simple by just using the two colors. Now adding RV10 on the inside of the ear as well as to the pupil of the eye. And like I've done on all the other characters so far, I'm using the white gel pen to add that little highlight there. Even though it's a little hard to see, it really is there. And finally, I'm adding finishing touches to the fur by using a warm gray marker, just to show where some shadows would be underneath the coat, as well as where the, I guess I'd call it a knee, for lack of a better way to saying it, distinguishing that from the foot, and adding some lines to the toes up at the top where there's that little tuft of hair, and on the inside of the ears where it's not pink. And I just go around all the edges of the rabbit to make sure that there's a little bit of distinction and it doesn't look nearly as flat as it did when we started, when it was just plain white. And the only thing left to do at this point is color in the clock, the bezel, as well as the chain. And I'm using Y28, which is Lionette Gold. This is a really cool color. It's almost metallic looking as compared to a lot of other Copic markers. I don't know of any that actually does tend to have a real metallic looking appearance. And as you can see, when I colored in that one yellow button, that it bled out to the side. And I'm not sure why it did that, unless there was just some extra ink that came out of the marker and I didn't notice at the time that it had. So I'm using my colorless blender to try to force as much of that ink through the paper. So now I'm ready to move on to the Cheshire Cat, and this is where I change a bit in terms of what I'm coloring with. You may be wondering why I chose to use Chameleon markers in this case instead of Copics. And the reason is because it was a lot easier to find a color that actually was really what I wanted. And I did try a lot of different Copic color combinations, and I ended up still continuing to come back to the Chameleon marker, so I'll just show you how this works. I am holding the blending chamber over the top of the marker, and as you can see, I'm experimenting with how many seconds to hold it in this upright position, because that determines how light the ink color is when it first comes out. So the secret to this is planning how you color so that you have the highlight where you want it, and I wanted it in the center of the tail, so that's why I'm showing you kind of on my test paper out to the side how I'm using them. And on the tail, I'm going to be alternating every other one as far as the pink color, and then we'll go back with a lavender color. So every time I move to a different segment of tail, I'm going to have to repeat this process of holding the pen and letting the blending fluid come in contact with the marker. And I am using the brush marker tip. I'm holding the chamber up for a full 3 to 4 seconds, even though I have this sped up a bit, so you probably wouldn't quite get that concept of how long I'm holding it because of that. Now what I'm doing is, as I skip to a different section, I start very close to the opposite edge and I start going back and forth, going towards the outside edge and letting it darker. And if it doesn't get dark enough when I want it to, I just use that piece of scratch paper to kind of get some of the color off and start it getting to, I guess, the darker shade as the blending solution is used up. And then when I take care of the outer edge, I come back on the opposite side and put a stripe of the darker color, and I don't try to blend that out. And then that way, as I'm moving across the tail, you're going to see that highlight is going to be pretty continuous. It's going in a curved line, but you will get a distinct impression of where that highlight line is the further along that I go in this process. So since this is pretty, it's going to be very repetitive as far as this goes, I'm going to speed it up just a little bit until I get through the pink color. And as I said, this is going to be very, very repetitive as I go through the rest of the tail with the pink color. And I'm going to switch here in just a second to the violet color, which is the BV2. And one of the differences I noticed with that color versus the pink color is that it actually seemed to take, I guess there was less of a difference between the color as far as when you use the blending solution and how much stronger the color gets. So there's not as wide a range as there is with the PK5 pen. So this is just something I observed when I was working with this marker. I do spend, when I work with a Chameleon marker, and this is a recommendation I have, is if you try it, that it's really best to do some experimentation as far as whether 2 or 3 seconds or up to 7 or 8 seconds are going to work for what you're doing. And really the best way to get familiar with this particular type of marker really is just to experiment and figure out what the ideal timing is. So in the case of this marker, I used far less time because I wanted it to get to the most intense color a bit faster. So I'm really only holding the blending chamber up for 2, at most 3 seconds. And if the section is really, really tiny, like that one line that I just skipped over, I didn't even bother trying to blend in that section because it's so tiny and you really just can't tell. Again, I'll speed up this process as I finish this section. And as soon as this is done, I'm going to continue working with the BV2 marker, but I'm going to be moving on to the cat's body. And what I will be doing on the stripes that are on the body that are purple is I will continue blending for a few seconds, actually several seconds, so that I get a much lighter version of that color as I'm coloring in the stripes. So as I move along, as soon as it starts getting a little bit darker, I put the blending chamber right on top, hold it vertically, and then go back to filling in the stripes that I'm coloring purple. And I'll continue that process until I've done every single one on the legs, or actually, parts of legs you can see on the face. And then at that point, I'm going to switch back, or actually I'm going to use a new pink marker to work on the face. And there are some tricks to making that work because of the way that these markers work. I found that I really needed to switch to a different pink color, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. Now the next thing I want to do is actually add some a darker shade, not a shade, but I'm not going to use the blender at all while I'm basically outlining the stripes, and I'm doing my best to make sure that I'm outlining on the inside of the stripes so it's not extending outside of the stamp line. So if you look closely, you can see I'm really doing my best to avoid adding the marker where it's going to be outside of that stamp line. Because when I change back to the 2 pink markers and work on the face, I'm going to be adding some additional outlining outside of those areas. to add contrast, and as you can see in the finished image on the left-hand side. So right now, for the middle of the face, I'm actually using a PK4 marker, and I'm not going to use the blending chamber at all as I use this marker. And I'm going to fill in the middle of the face, including around, well, you'll see where I'm coloring distinctly because it's around the eyes, the mouth, and around those 3 little stripes up at the top. So that will give me my lighter area for the face without having to worry about the time, the blending not working out, because I did experiment with using the PK5 marker in the blending solution, and it was really just about impossible to make this work right unless I switch my way of doing it. So as I pull out the PK5 marker, I'm going to start using the blending solution for very short periods of time, and what I mean by that is like 2 seconds, maybe 3. And I start by overlapping the color that is already there, the pink color that's there. And as the marker starts to get darker, then I start sticking or going towards the outside edges of the stamp image. And I think this will make more sense as you watch what I do. Is as I work through this and the darker the color is coming out, then I start staying right next to that edge so I don't get a darker color towards a lighter or the middle part of the face. So right here, if you really watch, you can see how that color is changing over to the really, really dark pink. So this is where it pays to just take your time and be patient and not get in a hurry so that you get a good result. And once these outside edges are nice and dark, I'm also going to add not some outlines, but I'm going to trace around the outside edge of those purple stripes. And you may not be able to really see because I'm holding this vertically, but as I move over and get them outlined, what you're going to see is now there's a lot of really cool contrast because I have the dark lavender on the inside of the stripe and that dark pink on the outside. And this is the same thing that I will be doing around the cat's body. I will be using that PK4 marker kind of in the center area, and then I will come back over all that with a PK5 marker where I'm using the blending solution in order to get that dark edge. So now I'm starting to blend in the lighter PK5 and then working towards the bottom of that cat's paws that are there tucked under his head. And repeating the process on the other side. So I'm using the light, while it's lighter, I use it to start going around the stripes, and then I concentrate the darker color as it's coming out on the bottom. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of hard to describe. I think it's probably easier to watch what I'm doing and just observe how the color's coming out, lighter and darker. When I get to the body area, I think it will be far more obvious what I'm doing. So I'm actually going to color in the entire white area with the PK4 first. So I'll go all around, and that's just one solid color. So this part is a lot simpler and faster as far as getting all the initial color laid down. So now this will just leave me with going back to the PK5 marker and doing the same thing I did with the face and the paws. So here we go again. I'm just kind of testing it to make sure I have the timing down. And for some reason, I decided to come back and go over the lines on the face again. I'm not sure why, but apparently I thought it needed a little more contrast there. So I'm doing the same thing. I start in the center at first, and then I very quickly start moving towards the edge as the color starts coming out darker and darker. And then I go back in the center again, and again I start moving in towards the center part of all those little stripes. And then whenever the color is at the darkest point, then I start outlining on each of the purple stripes, just like I did on the face and the paws. Pretty much same thing again here. And I'll speed that up. So as I'm working through the rest of the body, and this part is repetitive, this is getting close to the end of part 2, and part 3 is going to cover the coloring of the remaining characters, and then part 4 will be when we're putting all the backgrounds and colored images together after they're all die cut out. And I will be showing you the process in which I use my brother Scan and Cut to finish or die cut all the remaining images. So as you can see, I'm back to using the BV2 marker, and I'm going around the entire image, and I am coloring over the purple stripes and adding more contrast by coloring over the inside of the stripes again, and just going back in and making some final adjustments between the colored areas. So I'm using the PK4 marker right now to blend that out on the face. The final thing on the cat is to add the YG11 as the eye color. And for some reason, I just colored it as though it had regular pupils, but I did end up going back later and coloring in the entire white area with that same pen. I just didn't show it on the screen, but when we get to the final card, you'll see that's what I did. So now the Cheshire Cat is almost finished. And I'm just taking the black Copic multi-liner pen and making sure that nose is nice and black. And this is the conclusion of part number 2.